The wind was a raw, screaming thing, clawing at the high plains with talons of ice and snow. It tore across the endless white, a landscape erased and remade with every gust, swallowing landmarks and sound in its furious passage. Against this frozen maelstrom, a figure stumbled, little more than a shadow wrapped in tattered rags, each step a testament to a will flickering like a dying candle. This was Ilara, and she was adrift in a world that had offered her nothing but cruelty. Her breath hitched in ragged, burning gasps, each one a tiny, stolen victory against the cold that gnawed at her bones, promising oblivion. The remnants of what might have once been called clothes offered no solace, plastered to her skin by melting snow and the desperate sweat of her flight. Home was a forgotten word, a dream shattered so long ago its pieces were lost to the wind. Hope was a crueler joke, a phantom that had danced just out of reach too many times to be trusted. Now, there was only the snow, the wind, and the terrifying expanse of an indifferent wilderness. Her pursuers, those cold, calculating figures from a past she could never quite outrun, were a constant terror, a shadow in the back of her mind even here, in this desolate wasteland. They had taken everything, stripped her bare, not just of possessions, but of identity, of voice. She was a number, an asset, a thing to be reclaimed. The thought fueled a desperate surge of adrenaline, pushing her forward when every fiber of her being screamed for rest. But the body has its limits, and hers were long past. Vision blurred, a kaleidoscope of white and grey. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge of darker grey against the swirling white registered dimly. Smoke? A structure? It was too far, too impossible. Yet, her feet, numb and clumsy, turned towards it, an instinct older than despair. She fell, a soft crumple into a snowdrift, the fight finally draining out of her. The wind howled a lullaby of finality. This was it. The end of a chase, the end of a life that had known too little kindness. Darkness beckoned, a welcome relief from the pain. But then, through the roaring tempest, another sound. A rhythmic thud. A door, wrenched open, light spilling out like a fragile promise. A silhouette, broad and tall, framed against the sudden, shocking warmth. Silas had lived with the ghosts of his own past for so long that the solitude of his remote ranch was less a choice and more a necessity. The high plains were a harsh confessor, their winds carrying away words unspoken, their silences mirroring the quiet ache in his soul. He'd heard the wind's tricks before, its mournful cries mimicking human sorrow, but this faint, desperate sound, a frantic, weakening scrabbling at his door, was different. It was real. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man accustomed to conserving energy, his face weathered by sun and sorrow, eyes the color of a winter sky, wary and observant. He'd seen hardship, dealt it and received it in measures he no longer tallied. His hand rested on the heavy wooden door, a barrier against the world he'd largely forsaken. He wasn't a man who invited trouble, and trouble, in his experience, often arrived on the wind, looking desperate. Yet, the relentless, frantic knocking, now weaker, almost a sigh against the wood, tugged at something buried deep, something he thought long dead. He pulled the door inward, the wind snatching at it, flinging snow into the warm, firelit interior of his small cabin. And there she was. A heap of rags and frost, barely discernible as human, collapsed on his doorstep. He saw the desperation in the pale, gaunt face turned up towards him, eyes wide with a terror that transcended the storm. He saw the marks of a brutal journey, the hollows of starvation, the haunted look of a hunted animal. He saw himself, a lifetime ago, running from a different kind of storm. For a long moment, he just stood there, the wind whipping around him, the cold seeping in. His first instinct, honed by years of isolation and loss, was to close the door, to preserve his hard-won peace. But the woman made a small, choked sound, a plea that wasn't a word but an embodiment of utter desolation. He sighed, a plume of white in the frigid air. The ghosts could make room. He bent, his movement surprisingly gentle for a man of his size and rough exterior, and scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing. Her head lolled against his chest, a faint, almost inaudible whimper escaping her lips. Inside, the cabin was a haven of warmth and flickering light. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, logs crackling merrily, casting dancing shadows. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and coffee. It was a place of stark simplicity, built for survival, not comfort, yet tonight, it felt like a sanctuary. He laid her gently on the worn rug before the fire, her body trembling violently now that the numbing cold was receding. Her eyes fluttered open, fixing on him with a raw, primal fear. He said nothing, simply moved to the small stove, ladling warm broth from a pot into a chipped mug. His actions were practical, efficient. He found an old, clean blanket, threadbare but soft, and draped it over her. He knelt, offering the mug. Her hands were too stiff, too frozen to hold it. He guided it to her lips, tilting it slowly. She sipped, coughed, then sipped again, the warm liquid a shock to her system. He watched her, his expression unreadable. This was a complication he hadn't sought, a life thrown into his lap by the storm. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she flinched if he moved too quickly. He recognized the signs of deep trauma. He knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that she wasn't just fleeing the storm. She was fleeing something far worse. He tended to her frost-bitten fingers and toes with a quiet competence, his touch surprisingly careful. He found some of his late wife's old clothes, a simple woolen dress, thick stockings, things he hadn't been able to bring himself to part with. They would be too big for this wraith of a woman, but they were warm and clean. He left them beside her, along with a basin of warm water and a cloth, then retreated to the far side of the small room, turning his back to give her privacy, his gaze fixed on the storm still raging outside the small, frosted window. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind. Ilara watched him, every nerve ending screaming. Men had been the architects of her suffering, their hands the instruments of her pain. But this man, he was different. There was a stillness about him, a weariness that spoke not of cruelty, but of sorrow. He hadn't hurt her. He had brought her in from the storm. He had given her warmth, sustenance. These were simple acts, yet in her world, they were profound. Slowly, painfully, she shed her frozen rags, the movement an agony. The warm water was a blessing, the clean clothes a forgotten luxury. Dressed, she huddled back under the blanket, closer to the fire, exhaustion a heavy weight. She still expected the other shoe to drop, the kindness to curdle into something monstrous. It always had. But the rancher remained by the window, a silent sentinel. The only words he'd spoken were a low murmur when he'd found her, something lost to the wind, something that might have been, not again, or perhaps, you're safe now, she couldn't be sure. The firelight cast his rugged profile in flickering gold and shadow. He was a man carved from the harsh landscape itself, strong, unyielding, yet in the set of his shoulders, she saw a profound loneliness. Sleep, deep and blessedly empty, finally claimed her, there on the floor of a stranger's cabin, with the storm raging outside and an unknown future waiting. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny, fragile seed of something other than fear began to stir within her. It was too small to be called hope, but it was there, a flicker in the overwhelming darkness. Days bled into a slow, quiet rhythm, measured by the rising and setting of a sun that seemed reluctant to break through the heavy clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world pristine and silent, draped in a thick mantle of snow. Inside the small cabin, an equally quiet dance unfolded between Silas and Ilara. He moved about his chores with a practiced efficiency, tending to the few hardy animals he kept in a lean-to-verfugen, chopping wood, mending tack. He was a man of few words, his silence not unkind, but deeply ingrained, like the lines etched around his eyes. He left food for Ilara on the small wooden table, warm bread, stew, sometimes a piece of dried fruit, a rare treat. He never pressed her to eat, never asked questions, never intruded on the fragile shell she had built around herself. He simply provided, his actions speaking a language of care that resonated more deeply than any words could. Ilara watched him from her haven by the fire. Her fear was a living thing, a coiled serpent in her belly, but it slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to loosen its grip. This man, Silas, as she'd overheard him murmur his name once to a stubborn mule, showed no signs of the cruelty she had come to expect. His hands, though calloused and strong, were gentle when he'd tended her frostbite, steady when he'd offered her broth. He gave her space, an almost reverent distance, as if he understood the invisible wounds she carried. He'd found an old, mended nightgown and a heavy wool shawl, placing them near her sleeping pallet without a word. The simple dress he'd first given her, though too large, felt like armor, a shield against the memory of the rags she'd arrived in. She spent her days huddled by the fire, the warmth seeping into her chilled bones, a physical comfort that began to touch the frozen core of her spirit. Sleep was still a battlefield, haunted by fragmented images of cold metal, sterile rooms, and the detached voices of her captors discussing her as if she were inanimate. They were from the Consolidated Sectors, a powerful, sprawling entity that had risen from the ashes of old wars, its reach extending across scarred continents. They valued order, efficiency, and above all, control. Individuals with unique talents, or aberrations as they termed them, were either assimilated or eliminated. Elara had been marked as an asset, her peculiar resilience, her ability to endure where others broke, deemed too valuable to waste, yet too dangerous to leave untamed. Her escape had been a desperate, improbable act, fueled by a primal need to be free, to be more than a designation, a resource. Now, in the quiet of Silas's cabin, those memories would surge, and she would wake with a silent scream caught in her throat, her heart pounding against her ribs. But then the steady rhythm of Silas's breathing from his cot across the room, the scent of wood smoke, the sight of the dying embers in the hearth, would slowly pull her back from the brink. He never acknowledged these nighttime terrors, though she knew he must hear her. His quiet forbearance was a gift. Slowly, tentatively, she began to move beyond the immediate circle of the fire. She would watch him as he worked, his hands sure and capable as he repaired a broken hinge or sharpened an axe. There was a rightness to his movements, a deep connection to the tools of his solitary life. One morning, she found a broom propped by the door. Without a word, she began to sweep the rough wooden floor, the simple, repetitive action a strange comfort. Silas entered, stamping snow from his boots, and merely nodded, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It was the first task she had undertaken, the first small step towards reclaiming some agency. He started leaving small tasks for her, unspoken invitations. A pile of potatoes to be peeled, a basket of mending. She did them meticulously, finding a quiet satisfaction in the work. It was a language they both understood, this dialogue of shared tasks, of mutual, unspoken acknowledgement. The silence between them remained, vast but no longer entirely empty. It was filled with the sounds of their separate existences beginning to intertwine, the scrape of her knife against a potato, the thud of his axe splitting wood, the soft rustle of her mending needle, the steady tick of an old wooden clock on the mantelpiece. One afternoon, while he was outside, she found a small, carved wooden bird tucked away on a high shelf. It was worn smooth with handling, its painted details faded. She picked it up, her fingers tracing its delicate lines. It felt like a piece of someone's heart, left behind. When Silas returned, he saw her holding it. For a moment, his face tightened, a shadow of profound grief passing over his features. He simply said, his voice rough, "My daughter." She liked birds. He took it gently from her hand and replaced it on the shelf, his back to her. Elara's breath caught. Loss. That was the ghost that haunted him, the source of the deep sorrow in his eyes. She understood loss. She had lost her family, her home, her name, her voice. She looked at his broad, stooped shoulders and felt a pang of empathy, a fragile thread connecting her pain to his. That evening, as he sat by the fire, staring into the flames, she spoke, her voice raspy from disuse, barely a whisper. "Thank you." Silas turned, his expression surprised. It was the first time she had spoken more than a single, necessary word to him. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're welcome, Elara." He knew her name. She hadn't told him. Had she murmured it in her fevered state upon arrival? Or had he simply known? The thought sent a small shiver through her, not of fear, but of something else, something akin to wonder. The snows began to melt, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, revealing the bruised and battered earth beneath. The world outside the cabin windows was transforming, from a stark monochrome canvas to one touched with the subtle hues of approaching spring. Rivers of meltwater carved new paths, and the air, though still crisp, carried the scent of damp earth and the promise of new life. This change in the landscape seemed to mirror an internal shift within Ilara. The heavy cloak of her trauma still clung to her, but its suffocating weight had lessened. The constant, gnawing fear of pursuit hadn't vanished, but it no longer held her paralyzed. In the quiet sanctuary of Silas's ranch, with its predictable rhythms and his unwavering, unobtrusive presence, she had found a sliver of peace, a place to simply breathe. She spoke more now, though still sparingly. Short sentences, observations about the weather, a quiet question about a task. Each word was a victory, a reclamation of a part of herself she thought irretrievably lost. Silas, in turn, offered brief responses, his gruffness softened by a growing gentleness in his eyes when he looked at her. He never pried, never pushed for details of her past, accepting her presence as he accepted the changing seasons, with a quiet resignation that was slowly evolving into something warmer. He began to include her more directly in the life of the ranch. He showed her how to milk the one placid cow, how to scatter feed for the chickens, how to identify the edible shoots of green beginning to poke through the thawing ground. Her hands, once soft and then brutalized by her escape, grew stronger, more capable. There was a solace in the physical work, a sense of contributing, of belonging, however tenuous. One day, he was mending a fence line at the edge of his property, the vast, empty plain stretching out before them. Ilara accompanied him, carrying tools. The silence between them was companionable, punctuated by the clang of the hammer against staples. She watched a hawk circling high overhead, a speck of wild freedom against the pale blue sky. "They took my name," she said, the words emerging unexpectedly, surprising even herself. Silas paused, hammer in hand. He didn't turn, just kept his gaze on the horizon. "What was it?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated. To speak it aloud felt like giving power to those who had tried to erase it. But here, with this man, in this quiet place, it felt different. "My given name. Before they called me Unit 734". Silas finally turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a deep anger in their depths, but also a profound understanding. "Names are important," he said softly. "They tell us who we are. Unit 734 is not a name. It's a brand." He drove a staple into the post with a sharp, definitive thud. "What do you want to be called?" Ilara looked down at her hands, then back up at him, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "Ilara. My name is Ilara." A small smile touched the corners of Silas's lips, a rare and warming sight. "Ilara it is," he said. "It's a good name." That small exchange shifted something fundamental. By acknowledging her name, he acknowledged her humanity, her right to exist as more than a fugitive, more than a victim. He had given her back a piece of herself. She began to explore the cabin more freely, her initial fear replaced by a quiet curiosity. She discovered a small collection of books, their pages worn and softened with age, tales of adventure, poetry, guides to plants and stars. She would read by the firelight in the evenings, the words a balm to her weary soul. Silas would watch her sometimes, a wistful expression on his face. He told her, in one of his rare moments of disclosure, that his wife, Sarah, had loved to read. He spoke of her briefly, his words tinged with a sorrow that was still raw, even after all these years. He mentioned their daughter, Lily, who had her mother's bright spirit, taken too soon by a fever that had swept through the settlements decades ago. Ilara listened, her heart aching for his loss. She understood the hollow space that grief carved into a life. She didn't offer empty platitudes, just sat with him in the shared silence, a silent acknowledgement of their mutual scars. The ranch, once just a temporary refuge, began to feel like something more. The sturdy log walls, the warmth of the fire, the vast, protective expanse of the land around them, it was becoming a sanctuary. She found herself noticing the small beauties, the way the morning light slanted through the window, the intricate patterns of frost on the glass, the distant call of a coyote at dusk. These were things she hadn't allowed herself to see for so long, her senses dulled by fear and survival. One evening, as a soft rain pattered against the roof, a gentle counterpoint to the crackling fire, Silas was attempting to fix a small, intricate music box. His large hands fumbled with the delicate mechanism. Ilara watched him for a moment, then hesitantly reached out. "May I?" she asked. He looked surprised, then handed it to her. Her smaller, nimbler fingers carefully examined the tiny gears and springs. She had always had a knack for such things, a patience for intricate work, a skill her captors had tried to exploit for their own sterile purposes. After a few minutes of focused effort, a tiny, tinkling melody filled the cabin, fragile and sweet. Silas stared, a look of stunned wonder on his face. "Sarah's," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I haven't heard that in years." He looked at Ilara, truly looked at her, and saw not just the haunted fugitive, but a woman of hidden depths, of quiet strength and unexpected talents. A genuine smile, the first she had ever seen transform his entire face, lit his eyes. "Thank you, Ilara," he said, his voice husky. "Thank you." In that moment, surrounded by the gentle rain and the sweet, forgotten melody, the last vestiges of winter seemed to melt away from Ilara's heart. The tentative peace they had cultivated was as fragile as the first spring blossoms. Ilara knew, with a chilling certainty that never fully receded, that her past was not a closed chapter. The consolidated sectors did not simply let assets go. They were relentless, patient, their reach like an insidious vine. She saw it in the way Silas's gaze would sometimes linger on the horizon, a little too long, his jaw tight. He knew it too. He hadn't asked about who or what she was running from, but he was a man who understood the nature of pursuit. The foreshadowing came subtly at first. A lone rider, too well-equipped for a simple traveler, spotted far in the distance, observing the ranch through field glasses before melting back into the rolling hills. An unusual silence from the coyotes at night, as if even the wild creatures sensed an alien presence. Silas became more watchful, his movements quieter, his hand rarely straying far from the old, reliable rifle he kept propped near the door. He began to reinforce the shutters, check the perimeter more frequently. He didn't speak of his concerns, but Ilara felt the shift in him, a tensing of the quiet strength that had become her anchor. Then, one cold, clear morning, they arrived. 3 figures on sleek, silent land skimmers, vehicles that hummed with a suppressed power utterly alien to the rustic tranquility of the plains. They wore the stark, emotionless grey uniforms of sector enforcers, their faces obscured by reflective visors that mirrored the vast, indifferent sky. They moved with a chilling precision, fanning out as they approached the cabin, their movements economical and predatory. Ilara was by the creek, gathering water, when she saw them. A gasp lodged in her throat, cold terror gripping her, threatening to send her back into that dark, silent place of utter helplessness. Her first instinct was to flee, to disappear into the wilderness again. But then she thought of Silas, of the tentative sanctuary he had offered, the kindness that had begun to mend her shattered spirit. She thought of the name he had helped her reclaim. Ilara. Not Unit 734. She straightened, the water bucket slipping from her numb fingers, splashing unheeded at her feet. She would not run. Not this time. Silas emerged from the cabin, rifle held loosely but ready at his side. His face was a grim mask, his eyes narrowed, fixed on the approaching enforcers. He'd seen their kind before, or similar enough, men who served systems rather than conscience. He stood his ground, a bulwark between them and the fragile peace he had guarded so fiercely. The lead enforcer, a tall, imposing figure, glided to a halt a dozen paces from Silas. His voice, when he spoke, was amplified, metallic, devoid of inflection. Unit 734. Designated for reclamation. Stand aside, citizen. This does not concern you. Silas didn't flinch. His voice, when he replied, was low and steady, carrying clearly in the crisp air. Her name is Ilara. And she's not going anywhere. The enforcer's head tilted slightly, an almost reptilian gesture. The asset is property of the consolidated sectors. Obstruction carries severe penalties. She's not property, Silas stated, his grip tightening on the rifle. She's a human being. Under my protection, Ilara had reached the cabin, standing slightly behind Silas, her heart hammering but a new, unfamiliar resolve hardening within her. She saw the enforcer's gaze flick to her, dismissive, calculating. They didn't see her. They saw a resource, a problem to be managed. The metallic voice cut through the air again. Your interference is regrettable. We have authorization to use necessary force. The other two enforcers shifted, their hands moving towards the sophisticated sidearms holstered at their hips. The air crackled with unspoken threat. This was the moment. The point of no return. Silas didn't waver. He was an old man, perhaps, by their standards, a relic of a bygone era, armed with an antiquated weapon against their advanced technology. But there was a power in his stance, a lifetime of quiet resilience forged into an unbreakable will. You'll have to come through me, he said, his voice resonating with a conviction that was absolute. Then, Ilara found her voice. It was stronger than she expected, clearer. No, she said, stepping forward to stand beside Silas, not behind him. She looked directly at the lead enforcer, meeting the blankness of his visor. I will not go back. I am not your property. The enforcer paused. This was unexpected. Assets weren't supposed to have will, to speak with such defiance. He raised a hand, a signal. The other two enforcers began to advance, their movements fluid, menacing. Silas raised his rifle. Last chance, he growled. The confrontation was brutal and swift. It wasn't a prolonged battle of attrition, but a sudden, violent clash of old ways and new, of raw determination against cold efficiency. The enforcers were fast, their energy weapons spitting silent, coherent light that seared the air. But Silas was a man of the land, his movements honed by a lifetime of survival. He fired, not wildly, but with deadly precision, years of hunting guiding his aim. One enforcer cried out, a human sound of pain that seemed out of place with their sterile image, stumbling back as his weapon clattered to the ground. Ilara, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and a desperate need to protect the only kindness she had known in years, acted on instinct. She grabbed a heavy piece of firewood from the stack near the door and, with a defiant cry, swung it with all her might at the leg of the second advancing enforcer, catching him off balance. He staggered, his visor cracking from the impact, revealing a startled, angry human face beneath. The lead enforcer, seeing his advantage lost, his unit compromised by unexpected resistance, made a tactical decision. He fired a single, disabling shot that struck Silas high in the shoulder, sending him staggering back with a grunt of pain. Before he could press his advantage, Ilara was there, a whirlwind of desperate fury, positioning herself between him and the fallen rancher. "Leave him alone," she screamed, her voice raw. The enforcer hesitated. His mission was the asset. Protracted conflict in an unsecured area was inefficient. He looked at Ilara, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a docile unit, but as a fierce, determined woman. He looked at Silas, wounded but still defiant, struggling to rise. With a curt, frustrated gesture, he signaled a retreat. The remaining enforcer helped his injured comrade onto a skimmer. The leader gave Ilara one last, cold look. "This is not over, Unit 734. The sectors do not forget. Then, as silently as they had arrived, they were gone, their humming vehicles disappearing over the horizon, leaving behind a shattered silence and the scent of ozone. Ilara rushed to Silas's side, her hands trembling. "Silas! Are you all right?" He was pale, blood seeping through his shirt, but his eyes were clear, fixed on her face. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Just a scratch," he lied, his voice weak. You were brave, Ilara." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face, tears not of fear this time, but of a fierce, protective love. "They're gone," she whispered, helping him lean against the cabin wall. They're gone together. They had faced the darkness, and for now, they had driven it back. The sanctuary had been violated, but in its defense, something new and incredibly strong had been forged between them. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over the ranch like a shroud, heavy and somber. The metallic tang of discharged energy weapons lingered in the air, a stark reminder of the violence that had breached their quiet world. Ilara, her earlier terror now transmuted into a focused determination, tended to Silas's wound with a surprising competence. Her hands, though still trembling slightly, were steady as she cleaned and bandaged the searing burn on his shoulder. He watched her, his expression a mixture of pain, pride, and a deep, weary gratitude. The wound was painful, a throbbing ache that reminded him of his age, but the greater pain was the violation of their sanctuary, the knowledge that the wolves had found their door. "They'll be back," he said, his voice raspy, stating the grim truth that lay unspoken between them. Ilara nodded, her gaze not leaving her task. "I know," she finished tying the bandage, her touch gentle. "But we were ready for them this time." "We'll be ready next time." He looked at her, truly looked at her. The frightened, half-starved creature who had collapsed on his doorstep was gone. In her place stood a woman, slender and still bearing the scars of her past, but with a core of tempered steel in her eyes, a resilience that mirrored the harsh beauty of the plains themselves. She had found her voice, her strength, not in spite of her trauma, but perhaps because she had survived it, and because someone had finally offered her a hand instead of a cage. "You saved my life, Ilara," Silas said quietly, the words simple, yet carrying immense weight. She met his gaze, her own eyes luminous with unshed tears. "You saved mine first, Silas. You gave me a place to heal. You gave me, or a home." The word hung in the air, precious and fragile. Home. It was more than just the sturdy log walls of the cabin, more than the crackling fire or the shared meals. It was the unspoken understanding, the quiet companionship, the fiercely protective bond that had been forged in shared silence and now, in shared peril. For days, they existed in a heightened state of awareness, scanning the horizon, listening for the unnatural hum of the skimmers. But the plains remained empty, the silence broken only by the wind and the calls of distant birds. The immediate threat had receded, leaving them to grapple with the new reality of their existence. Their relationship had shifted. The rescuer and the rescued, the protector and the protected, those lines had blurred, replaced by a partnership born of mutual respect and a shared will to survive, to live. Ilara took on more responsibility around the ranch, her movements sure and confident. She mended the damage to the cabin wall where an energy blast had struck, her hands surprisingly adept. She learned to use Silas's old hunting rifle, her aim steady, her resolve firm. She would not be helpless again. Silas, recovering slowly, watched her with a quiet wonder. He saw in her the reflection of the wife he had lost, not in appearance, but in spirit, in the quiet strength, the unwavering loyalty. His lonely existence had been irrevocably altered, his solitary world now shared, enriched, defended. One evening, they sat by the fire, the tension of the preceding days having eased into a weary calm. The cabin was filled with a comfortable silence, the kind that speaks of deep accord. Ilara was mending one of Silas's shirts, her brow furrowed in concentration. Silas watched the flames dance, his thoughts far away. "Sarah would have liked you," he said softly, the words unexpected. Ilara looked up, her needle pausing. A faint blush touched her cheeks. She planted those roses by the porch, didn't she?" she asked, remembering the gnarled, thorny bushes that were just beginning to show tiny buds of green. Silas nodded, a gentle smile gracing his lips. Every spring, she'd fight the frost to make them bloom. Stubborn as the winter wind, he looked at Ilara, his gaze deep and searching. This place, it was just a shell after she and Lily were gone. Just me and the ghosts. He reached out, his calloused hand covering hers, stilling her mending. His touch was warm, firm. "You brought life back to it, Ilara. You brought life back to me." Her breath caught in her throat. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, held an emotion she had never expected to see directed at her, a profound tenderness, a deep, abiding affection. "Silas?" she began, her voice trembling. He gently squeezed her hand. "The enforcers, they might come back. This life, it's hard, it's uncertain." His gaze didn't waver. "But this is your home now, Ilara. If you want it." He hesitated, then the words came, quiet and true, a whisper that resonated louder than any shout in the vast stillness of the plains. "Stay. Stay with me, Ilara. not just until the danger passes. Stay, always. The words echoed the sentiment of the title the universe seemed to have written for their story, a destiny whispered into existence. Her eyes filled with tears, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming relief, of gratitude, of a joy so profound it ached. She had no home, no clothes, no hope when she arrived. Now, she had found all three in the heart of this quiet, stoic rancher, in the shelter of his unlikely love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Silas. I'll stay." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. A sense of peace, deep and abiding, settled over them, as warm and comforting as the firelight that bathed the small cabin in its golden glow. They were two souls, scarred and weathered by life storms, who had found sanctuary in each other. An unconventional family, forged in hardship, bound by courage and kindness. The future was still uncertain, the threat of the consolidated sectors a shadow on the horizon. But now, they would face it together. The ranch was no longer just Silas's refuge, or Ilara's hiding place. It was their home, a testament to the enduring power of hope and the unexpected families we create in the most desolate of landscapes. The wind still howled across the high plains, but inside the small cabin, there was only warmth and the quiet promise of a shared tomorrow. What does it truly mean to find a home? Is it a place, a structure of wood and stone? Or is it something more, a feeling of safety, of belonging, of being seen and accepted for who you truly are, scars and all? Perhaps home is where kindness takes root, even in the harshest soil, and where two lonely souls can find the courage to whisper, "Stay with me forever." Think about the sanctuaries in your own life, the people who offer you shelter from the storm. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share your thoughts on what home means to you in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories of hope and human connection.